And we are now live on YouTube. Welcome to my YouTube audience. Again, I'm Carrie Donegan. You're watching the videos called Radical Age Reversal. We're here to help you age gracefully and slowly and in really, really good health. And to do that, we are focusing on the book 10% Human by Ilana Collin. And she does an incredible job of walking us through our microbiome, right? So we're 10% human genes that make up our tissues and everything that we can touch, see, feel from the outside, but also the things that we know on the inside. So our organ tissue, our blood, everything that goes on in there, but that's only 10% of who we are. In fact, the other 90% is this vast environment of microbes, good microbes that we need to function. And when we feed them, when we take care of them, they take care of us. And it is really a fascinating journey. If you missed the first couple of episodes, please go back and listen to them. But even if you haven't listened to them, you can jump right in and listen to this section of her book without any problem whatsoever once you know the topic that we're talking about. So today I'm going to start the second half of chapter 2, which is, second half of chapter 1, which is 21st century sickness. So in the first part of chapter 1, she talks a lot about the diseases that used to kill us, infectious disease, how science dealt with that, these, the rise of vaccines, the rise of antibiotics, the rise of different types of sterilization processes, and really, really fascinating science and things that I think we all knew and grew up with. I know one of my misconceptions as I was growing up was that all bacteria and fungus were bad, right? So you wanted to wash them off as much as possible. You wanted to sterilize everything in your environment. And that it was really, really important to keep everything super, super clean. But what were we leaving behind with this chemical warfare that we were doing to our environment and to our bodies? It was leaving actually behind a path of destruction. One of the things that we're coming to learn is that antibiotics know no friends. And so when they see any type of bacteria, they wholesale kill them off without any questioning of whether or not your body actually needs some of those bacteria. And so although the developments of the late 19th century into the early 20th century were ones that eradicated most, if not all, of infectious diseases, what we know is that we were left with these new diseases, these new 21st century illnesses. And she takes us in the second half of chapter 1 to an interesting case study, and that is that of the West and East German situation. So the unfortunate political situation of the divide of Germany did leave us with an interesting scientific opportunity. And that was in the 1990s when we went into these two halves, right, of Germany. And we started to look at how the health of these people were at the time in the 1990s. What exactly happened to them? And I'm just looking for my notes here. I apologize because I want to get this information right for you. I don't want to misquote her in any way, shape, or form, but like what exactly was happening there? And did everyone in Germany have the same type of health situation? Now I can say I lived through the reunification of Germany, and before I read this book, I would have assumed that the people in East Germany were probably undernourished because they had lack of access to modern healthcare and because they had lack of access to certain foods. I also would have assumed that the people in West Germany were a lot healthier, were a lot wealthier, and were living better lives. But it seems that that is actually not the case, which really, really surprised me. It was actually a little bit shocking. So let's take a look at what happened. So if you're looking in your book, let's look on page 47. And what it said was, I love this quote: with wealth comes chronic illness. Okay, so just keep that in mind. With wealth comes chronic illness. There is a correlation between wealth and chronic disease. So let's take a look at the German model, comparing East and West Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. West Germans, for example, were twice as likely to have allergies. Strange. In fact, allergies occur in very low numbers among impoverished kids, also lower rates of type 1 diabetes. Okay, so that was the result of the study that was done on East and West Germans, was that all of these new diseases that we were looking at, autism, obesity, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. I guess type 2 diabetes actually is an aging disease, but I'm going to bring it in because I'm seeing type 2 diabetes affecting young people more and more and more. Asthma, allergies, eczema. I call them the A diseases. Allergies, asthma, eczema, autism, all rolled into autoimmune diseases, right? All these A diseases. Why are we, unable to live the way we used to live in our environment? Because our environment is becoming less and less natural and more artificial. So there's another A word, right? So just remember all of these. Maybe that's a good way for you to remember the situation that we're in. 21st century diseases are atypical, and they're artificially driven. So if wealth is the factor that seems to be the common thread through people who are becoming chronically ill, then do we see these diseases in poor cultures and poor areas and poor environments? And the answer is yes. And so how did that happen? So what we know is that actually before the rise of these diseases, and we're going to learn that they kind of started in the 1940s, and then we have another sort of exponential growth in the 1960s, another exponential growth 20 years later in the 1980s, and then another growth in the 1990s. So you can see that the growth of these situations and the severity of these situations are actually getting larger as the years are getting tighter. So there's a smaller amount of time between stages of explosive growth. That should be a little bit concerning to all of us, if not actually kind of scary. So impoverished kids. In the past, we knew they actually had almost no allergies to be recorded. They also had really low rates of type 1 diabetes. But when we look at wealthier people, we see that, they have very high rates. Now, what we realize is that what starts in wealthy communities tends to trickle down into impoverished communities in a really unique way. So, for example, tobacco, prepared foods, and illegal drugs were actually the only accessible to people with a lot of money at the very beginning. But then they trickle down into these poorer communities. And what started out as something that was a luxury item for the very rich becomes kind of a staple item for the very poor. And I think it can even happen in the fact that we allowed government assistance and welfare to purchase some of these things. So we're actually giving the very poor, what we think, and I'm sure was originally designed to be a hand up, we're actually giving them a push down, because what they have access to is things like tobacco, prepared foods, drugs, which are ruining their gut microbiome, which are deteriorating their health, which are introducing them to these 21st century diseases without access to the necessary education to understand the effects of all of these things. So just take a step back. If you're watching TV or you're watching social media, which most Americans, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, have access to, and you see someone being glorified eating prepared foods or having fun, or you follow some kind of Instagram influencer who's talking about a lot of packaged foods, who's talking about, using tobacco, vaping, all kinds of different drugs, you're just assuming, well, if they're doing it, I want to do it too, right? You're not looking at the behind the scenes information that's so incredibly important. And what we find then is there's actually a turnaround in wealthier communities, because as information grows and we start to understand, oh, some of the things that we thought were benign are actually extremely dangerous. And there is a link between, if not a causation, a correlation between things like tobacco, prepared foods, prescription drugs, illegal drugs, to the long-term health outcomes of an individual, that people who have money and access to education will start to learn and change the way they live. But people who don't have access to this information, the poorer communities, actually continue to spend their money and to focus on these foods. And that's why we see this explosion of things like obesity, asthma, eczema, autism in poorer communities. So let's take another look at another example. I think we've talked about this before in the book, and that is the 1918 flu, also known as the Spanish flu. Now, 100 million people died during this time, which is, terrifying. And I think when COVID came up, one of the earliest memories that people had was of the 1918 flu. And there was a terror that struck the hearts of many Americans who either studied or lived through these times. And they thought, never again. They did not want COVID to turn into a mass epidemic with hundreds of millions of people dying. And what we know, actually looking back, is that only 1% of people who contracted COVID were even hospitalized. But we do know that people who were young were fine. People who were older or had compromised cardiometabolic issues. Okay, so these are modern diseases, the diseases of things, stroke, blood pressure issues, cholesterol issues, cardiovascular disease, obesity. This was the group of people who were really, really at risk when it came to COVID. So there is a connection between 21st century diseases and this new viral outbreak and how your body reacted to it. Now, what happened during the 1918 flu? During the 1918 flu, and in case you're following along in your books, this is on page 50. We're kind of in page 50, 51 right now. She talks about the fact that they assumed that, like most other flus of the past, that the flu would kill the young, the old, and the already sick. But what happened was young, strong adults were actually succumbing to the 1918 flu in massive numbers. And this was new. This was unheard of. This was very, very surprising to the medical community. And when they dug into why this happened, what they realized that it had to do with something called a cytokine storm. Now, during COVID, you may have heard this term before. I don't know if you looked it up or you already understand what it means. But for those of you for whom you might be hearing about it for the first time, a cytokine storm is your immune system's overreaction to something. It's very much like having an allergy. An allergy means that you have an overreactive histamine response, right? So you encounter a histamine, and instead of your body dealing with it on this level, your body may be dealing with it on a much more heightened level. And that's what we mean by a cytokine storm, only instead of it being a histamine response, it's the immune system's messenger chemicals that are reacting to your immune system's antiviral response. And in doing that, that immune response itself can lead to an overreaction, which is more dangerous than the virus itself. And so when we look at people who died of the 1918 flu, what we realize that most people who are healthy succumbed not to the disease itself, but to their body's immune system's overreaction. So when we're talking about, and again, I'm just going to go over these issues a little bit one more time so you kind of ingrain them in your head. I want you to think of 21st century diseases are artificially made, right? Artificial, man-made, man-issued environment diseases, right? So everything is about A's. So allergies, asthma, autism, autoimmune diseases, and then of course we have the exceptions to the A's, things like obesity and eczema. But just in general, I think if you start thinking about artificial causes lead to those A diseases, it'll just be an easy way for you to remember what we're talking about. So let's go through a scientific process to determine what potentially could be causing this new situation. Okay, so let's break it down by different human characteristics. The first one she talks about is age. And so these are all going to be answers to the question why, and she's going to cover all of these questions from pages 51 through 53. So if you're reading along and you want to make notes in your book or in your notebook, this is where we are. So who is affected? Let's look at age. So she talks about allergies, eczema, asthma, skin allergies often begin at birth. Autism presents in toddlers. Autoimmune disease affects mostly young adults. Obesity can start as young as birth, with 7% of American babies considered overweight at birth. Now, there is nothing that a child has done to become overweight at birth. So we know that there is something awry, there is something going wrong. And it isn't just that the mother was overweight so that the baby is overweight. There's a whole other host of factors going on underlying this real epidemic. I'm going to call it an epidemic of these artificial 21st century diseases and chronic diseases. Diabetes 1 starts in childhood, and other immune diseases present somewhere in the 20s, right? So we're looking at really, really young people with these diseases. So these are not diseases necessarily of aging. So given the above, we can kind of rule out that there is an aging component to what's going on right now. Now, weight gain in your younger years is also correlated with diseases of old age. So there is a correlation. We don't know if it's a causation right now, but if you were or are a young person with weight gain, your chances of succumbing to our current, I'm going to call them artificially based diseases of aging, because we know that age is a disease. That's why we started Radical Age Reversal. What's wonderful about that is that through lifestyle changes, we can reverse the damage that was done in your previous years. So these old age diseases are heart attack, stroke, diabetes 2, high blood pressure, and cancer. Okay, so those are your old age diseases, which are different from your younger diseases, the ones that we talked about earlier: autism, allergies, autoimmune diseases, and obesity. Okay, so age, not really a factor. Let's look at race. So Blacks, Hispanics, and South Asians have the highest rates of obesity, allergies, and autoimmune disease and autism, but in different groups. So for example, South Asians have the highest rates of obesity. Blacks have the highest rates of allergies and asthma. Whites have the highest rates of multiple sclerosis and childhood diabetes. So those are all autoimmune diseases. And Blacks have the highest rates of lupus and scleroderma, also autoimmune diseases. Autism, it occurs across the board. It seems to have no racial boundaries whatsoever. But one of the things we know is that Black children are often diagnosed later. Now, is that a factor of their ability to access really good education and diagnostic treatment? I would say probably that is a factor, certainly among inner city or poorer communities, but she doesn't really specify specifically that could be what's going on. Either way, we know that autism does not really know race. Now, could it be environment? Because Black children tend to live in higher concentrations in inner cities, which may be a contributing factor to asthma because they have less access to the essential oils, for example, that evergreen trees and trees give off. They have less access to the oxygen that plants give off that are going to help clean the lungs, right? So we know it's really important to have negative ions. Those are the things the trees give off. And if you live in an urban area where we have a lot of recirculated air, where you have a lot of pollution, and you don't have a lot of green plants, you're actually going to have greater health issues. Now, here's a really cool study that they looked at Blacks in Africa versus Blacks in Somalia. So Blacks in Africa have really, really low asthma rates. So I would step back and say it has nothing to do necessarily with your genetics. It has nothing to do with your race. It really has to do with your environment, but that's only my opinion based on the evidence she presents in her book. What she does say about Somalis is that there was a period in time where there was a mass migration and they migrated to countries like Canada and Sweden. Their next generation of children had high rates of autism. So why is that? What was happening in Somalia that wasn't happening in Canada and Sweden, or vice versa? What was going on in Canada and Sweden that was causing these higher rates of autism in children of the Somali migrants? Something to consider. All right, I'm going to leave that as like an open question because we don't really have definitive answers. Let's look at sex. Women have stronger immune systems. That's something that we know. When women get sick versus when men get sick, women recover in higher numbers, and the time that they're sick is often shorter. Now, I know, culturally, somebody could say that if you're a woman raising children, or if you work in and outside of the home, traditionally, you don't give yourself time to rest and recover the way that a man may. That's a cultural interpretation. And it's probably, those lines are much more blurred now in our modern society where men and women's roles have been blurred to a great extent. And it's hard to say which group is doing predominantly one role or another. But that is the statistic right now. Allergies, for example, affect young boys the most and adult women. So there seems to be something that happens during puberty that shifts the numbers in the two sexes. Now, gut issues, although are predominant in both men and women, or I should say occur in both men and women have a much larger number of gut issues. Obesity, which sort of surprised me, and I guess I didn't realize that I have to be more observant when I look around. Women actually suffer from obesity much higher numbers than men do. And women also suffer higher numbers of mood disorders. Now, this can be anything from anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide. I think we hear a lot about men's depression, not being able to find jobs, kids who are living, and that they're not kids, adult children living in their parents' basement. This tends to be higher numbers in men. That could be a rate of depression. But what they're saying is that when asked about depression and anxiety, a lot of men don't answer truthfully. So it's hard to know if those statistics about women suffering from mood issues being greater than men is a really true statistic, or if there are other cultural factors that fall into play. So I just wanted to give you kind of that whole picture that she provides in the book. There's also seems to be a female bias that happens after adult sex hormones become an influence. So I would throw a caution out to anyone who's listening to this about taking hormones for whatever reason. We know that hormones play a role in these diseases. And so if you are struggling with hormone imbalance, my recommendation would be to look at your lifestyle factors and your nutrition first to see if you can bring those hormones back into balance before you would take extreme measures of taking outside hormones to try to balance them. Not that that isn't an option for some people, and I know it is, but I think sometimes we tend to go to the highest level offering for a cure or a treatment than we do starting at the beginning, right? Like if you can solve something in a very simple way, isn't it worth trying, as opposed to going to the most extreme way? So those are factors I'd like everybody to consider. And when you're talking to your friends and family, get them to start thinking in those terms. Now let's talk about when did all of this happen? This may be the most important question. According to our author here, she says it is absolutely the most important question. So the rise between the 1940s and 1960s seems to be the time frame when all of these issues, right, these artificially driven issues of autism, autoimmune disease, allergies. I know you're probably sick of me repeating them, but I want you to get them in your head so that you know which diseases are sort of these older diseases, heart attack, cancer, blood pressure, versus allergies, eczema, autism, autoimmune diseases are different. They come at different times of life. They affect your body differently. They can all be changed through lifestyle, but we need to kind of see them in different camps. So what can we do to try to figure out what's going on in our own families and what may be coming in future generations? So I want you to do, I have a little homework for you for this episode. I want you to sit down and I want you to write down all the health challenges that you've ever faced in your life. And those can be anything from how often were you sick as a kid? What kind of treatments did you choose for those sicknesses? What did your diet look like? How has your weight been throughout your life? You know, are you someone who's kind of yo-yoed? Did you increase in your weight as you grew older? Did you start off heavy and actually lost weight later in life? Did you see that there was a change in your weight based on your going through puberty, or if you're a woman going through menopause? All of those things. How about your siblings? What was their health path? What was their health challenges? What were their health choices? And how were those health outcomes? How about your parents? Same questions. What was their health history? What were their health choices? What were their lifestyle choices? What were their lifestyle outcomes? And also, if you know your grandparents or even your great grandparents, get this information down and see if you can see a pattern. Now, one of the things I really like to look at, and I like to use, I should say, is a free app called Obsidian. And Obsidian is a place where you can take notes. I have no connection to Obsidian whatsoever. I just really enjoy the platform. Again, it is free. And here's a really cool thing about answering these questions using Obsidian. If you answer these questions using Obsidian, Obsidian creates something called a spiderweb connection. So as you're typing notes, say, for example, and you start a new note on yourself, your siblings, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and you start to write down keywords, those keywords will start to spider, and the Obsidian app will build already like a graph that will start to correlate some of the things that may be going on in your family's health history. So that might be a valuable tool for you. If you haven't used it, maybe go ahead and check it out. If you have some other note-taking or other app that you really love and you want to share it with me, go ahead and put it in the comment section. I love to learn from all of you. And I know technology is not necessarily my greatest strong suit, but when I get something that I really love and enjoy, I want to share it with all of you to make your lives easier. So other questions we can answer. What has changed in our society? And here's some of the points that she lists at the end of the chapter, and I think they're worth noting, so I'm going to go through them. We've gone from frugal to indulgent. We've gone from traditional to progressive. We've gone from lacking luxuries to be bombarded with them. We've gone from poor healthcare to excellent healthcare. We've gone from budding to a blooming pharmaceutical industry. We've gone from an active to a sedentary lifestyle. We've gone from living in a provincial way, you know, very locally, not traveling, to a very global way where people are traveling all the time. We have gone from a mindset of make do and mend it to refresh and replace it. And we've also gone from an attitude that's very prudish and very reserved to very inhibited and just everything goes. So those factors, which are not value judgments, can be looked at as potential correlations or even eventual causations to the current 21st century sicknesses that we're dealing with. And this leads us into chapter 2, which is called All Diseases Begin in the Gut, where I think she's going to start to bring us into the meat or the vegetable, as it were, of the matter of how we're moving forward to discover what our gut microbiome actually does for us and what we can do for it. I really appreciate your time, both the win-win-win audience and my YouTube audience. Please join me next week for chapter 2. I always like to say I'll get through the whole chapter, but maybe I won't. Maybe we'll break it into 2 parts. My goal is to give you the most accurate information in a way that you'll be able to understand it and then share it with other people. If you like this show, please subscribe and like my channel and share it with others. There is no cost to any of this information, and I hope it is something that brings value into your life. I will see you next Monday at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This is our new time slot. I hope you enjoy it. We'll see you soon.